There are two things that strike fear in the hearts of RON players. A grandmaster using an aircraft carrier and... So, the aircraft carrier. This thing has traumatized me. But what makes it so annoying? Well, it's cheap for the immense power it brings, and this piece of shit can hit almost any speck of dust in the world because of its insane range. It's no wonder most events ban the use of it, because this thing can just fill in any gaps in your army. Oh, you lack troops? Just play an aircraft carrier and watch as it destroys your opponent's army within seconds. Oh, you plan on invading someone? Just play an aircraft carrier and they can't spawn any troops in their territory. Oh, your wife left you? Just play an aircraft carrier. You'd expect it to just be strong, not an entire fucking Death Star. The long distance is actually all of fucking France, and bombarding is a very bad word when it can reduce any number of troops to 1. A better description would be the aircraft carrier is capable of reducing enemy numbers to 1 per unit stack, while also needing no refueling and no need for ammunition. And you only need 25,000 men to own a weapon capable of obliterating the entire human race. The mere existence of an aircraft carrier makes you unable to do any ground combat before you have naval superiority, because a single aircraft carrier is somehow better at killing people than 2 world wars combined. The aircraft carrier also has the ability to damage aerial units and other naval units to add on top of its already insane uses. Of course, it's very vulnerable to naval units on its own, but if you just have escorting ships, and then the only way to beat it is by having a bigger navy. However, it wasn't always like this. You see, once upon a time, it was even worse. How can it be worse? Today you can enjoy several counters to the aircraft carriers, thanks to the recent updates, like anti-air, reducing the damage taken from ACs, and the needing to construct and upgrade your shipyard before you can spawn an aircraft carrier in the first place. But like I said before, these are recent additions. Before them, the aircraft carrier was a menace. Just the sight of it early game was enough to get you down on your knees and pray to God. Let's start from the beginning, shall we? Between the release of Rise of Nations and October 6th, 2022 was the insane era of the aircraft carrier. This was our nuclear weapon. The only counter to an aircraft carrier and its escorting navy back then was an even bigger navy. In other words, you needed a bigger economy to even think about beating it. There was no damage distance scaling, so any aerial units that tried to approach the aircraft carrier would just fucking die. Unlike today, where the aerial units will take less damage the further away they are, and more damage the closer they are to the AC. And since there was also no need to build shipyards before you could spawn aircraft carriers, I think you can guess what happened. As soon as the game started, an aircraft carrier would just literally be number 1 on the priority list, both for superpowers and regional powers alike. But since superpowers have stronger economies, they simply just won by sheer numbers. Yeah, those years of superpowers molesting European players with aircraft carriers will never be forgotten. Even I was a victim when I was a beginner. It was even worse during this period because being able to sell electronics, like consumer goods today, was still a thing. It was just much faster to sell electronics compared to consumer goods, and bigger economy equals spawning an aircraft carrier much faster. It was so bad actually that the Falkland Islands could even spawn an aircraft carrier within the first years. Actually no, the Falkland Islands weren't even real until like July 2022. But you get the point. Just look at old Rise of Nations videos and you'll see how these people used aircraft carriers within the first year of the game starting, and destroying everyone. That's important. The aircraft carrier back then was affordable to everyone if you knew how to sell electronics, it was unstoppable in terms of damage, it could be spawned within the first year of the game starting, and the only way to counter it was having a bigger economy, which effectively made superpowers unstoppable. What could possibly have nerfed it? That's right, the electronics nerf. Honestly, it wasn't that big of a setback though, you just had to adapt and sell consumer goods instead, but for most people that was very difficult in the beginning. After a few months, We went back to the era of seeing aircraft carriers everywhere again. Albeit now you actually had to know how to manage your economy instead of just brainlessly selling electronics. Yeah, no, this update wasn't the nerf. An unintentional buff would actually come before the nerf in the form of inland seas on November 11th, 2022. Since the aircraft carrier's strength is its massive range and its weakness is that it's weak to naval units, why not just put them inside a sea where your enemies can't reach it? Genius. Yup, this update revamped the entirety of Africa and made inland seas, actually inland seas. Of course, inland seas already existed in several continents before, like in North America, but this update just simply cemented the aircraft carrier's overwhelming rule in 3 different parts of the world from now on. These places were, and still is, the best possible locations for putting your capital on, if you have control of the entire sea. And to my absolute frustration, aircraft carriers wouldn't receive a single nerf for 7 more months, until June 21st, 2023. June 21st, 2023. The first time Hyperent directly nerfed the aircraft carrier. And it released in a bugged state. So this update added damage reduction from aircraft carriers if you are in the range of an anti-aircraft. And apparently, this protection would scale depending on the amount of anti-aircraft you have. But this simply is not the case. 10 anti-air is as useful as 1,000. I have no idea if this is a bug or an intended feature. I mean, aircraft carriers took 4 years to get a single nerf, and he hasn't touched this feature since release, so I don't know. But that doesn't really matter, because 1 anti-aircraft was enough to reduce the damage to destroyer level, and combine the anti-air with artillery, and the aircraft carriers could no longer be close to any land. The era of domination was no more. However, it was still an annoyance since an aircraft carrier basically forced you to buy anti-air and artillery, and since it could also freely travel by water, it could just escape much faster compared to support units, and therefore you had to invade really slowly, in pace with your anti-air, unless you wanted to taste the full force of an aircraft carrier. The only way to kill it was still just with a bigger navy. But that would all change on October 25th. 2023, with the attacker buff against naval units. In Hyperent's own words, attackers are no longer like biplanes going against modern ships. Aerial units would no longer just fucking die to naval units anymore. Now you could reliably counter a big navy with a shit ton of planes. It was always hard to hide your build-up of naval units, since your opponent could just snipe them with their bigger navy, but now you could actually just run away and go out of range of the aircraft carriers, and then attack later after you've built up a sizable air force. The update on December 7th, 2023 would finally put the nail in the coffin on aircraft carriers. You now had to build shipyards before you could spawn an aircraft carrier, so they were no longer a common occurrence in early game. And the naval damage distance skilling to aircraft made attackers even stronger against aircraft carriers. And on top of that, the doctrines were revamped, so now you could choose an aerial doctrine that made you able to spam attackers. This was truly the end of the aircraft carriers. Kinda. At least in the early game. Today, against any players that don't know how to counter it, it's basically a deus ex machina. But if you do know how to counter it, it simply becomes an annoyance. It's a unit you should bring into your naval composition, because it can catch people off guard. However, it's no longer an unstoppable force, and can be countered by a ton of attackers. To new players, aircraft carriers can seem useless if you need to kill with just one submarine, but it can also seem impossible to beat if they are escorted by a big navy. To experienced players, the aircraft carrier might seem too expensive because it forces a certain action to be played. Whenever you see an AC, you have to build anti-air, which can get tiring. What do you think? Should the aircraft carrier remain as is, be nerfed, or be buffed again? At least we won't be molested again in the foreseeable future. Instead, we will be molested by infantry spam.